The incidence of HIV, malaria, tuberculosis declined again between 2000 and 2015. Still a lot of work to do. And between 2011 and 2014, the proportion of the world's adult population that had an account at a financial institution and mobile money service, so bringing technology into it, increased by over 11% to 62%. 700 million more adults became account holders and had some control over their own destiny with technology and with finance. So, the role of philanthropy. You know, we used to think about private philanthropy in international development context as kind of an extra. You know, if we could just raise that unrestricted money to cover the lights, or we could just, you know, try to get those major gift reps to give us a little more money for co-funding or hiring ahead of the curve. And indeed, those dollars are still critical to all of us and to the capacity needed for local organizations around the world on the ground, which we heard a lot more about at lunchtime. But the U.S. philanthropic landscape is more important than that. All of you know, we've begun to climb out of the recession years and now are hitting records each year of overall philanthropy. Still only 2% of the GDP, so don't give up all the hard work you're doing. But it's, you know, climbing, which is very, very important. So you'll see here we're hitting 390, 400 billion. But the interesting thing about that is the role of private philanthropy in international development. So the past 2 years, private philanthropy has now significantly exceeded funding from the U.S. government for developing countries. You'll see here 33 billion coming from the U.S. government, USAID being a major, major player in all that, but now almost 44 billion coming from the private sector. And so if we are to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, we cannot rely on U.S. government or any form of government funding alone. We must continue to see this as our own personal, our own organizational, and our society's objectives. And we must realize that all forms of investment are going to be essential. It's also changing in terms of how people give philanthropy. One of the things I'm excited about with Global Washington is that coming together as a collaborative, being a collective, being issue-based, taking on issues that are important to the membership is increasingly becoming important to donors so that they can see the progress being made by the Sustainable Development Goals. And technology is no longer an extra. Technology is no longer a mechanism just to be able to give money. Technology is now a way in which you make sure that people in Puerto Rico know what resources they have as they continue to try to recover. Technology is how you tell the story of what's really happening, and technology is how you connect donors to beneficiaries and to issues they care about. And there are many other interesting things happening. Millennials, who now are a majority of the workforce, actually demand that they maximize their social impact throughout their day, throughout their nighttime, and they must be engaged and they must feel like they're making a difference. Otherwise, they won't give. And even then, we have to be patient because they really have to be able to see this as part of their overall social impact, including their giving. Things like donor advised funds are not going away. They're becoming even more important as people want to become strategic and they want to be able to have their own foundation and have, you know, a say in their giving. So the role of private philanthropy is here and will continue. You'll see here funding for disasters. Just like overall global development, we really rely on government. But now you're beginning to see kind of the evolution of private philanthropy even in disasters. Harder in man-made disasters and refugee crisis to raise those kind of dollars, but you see the same kind of trajectory beginning to occur. Okay? Next. So, how does this book, Take Me With You, relate? What I want to do is take you on a short journey and make it personal for you and for me. The book was written as a childhood story of a 12-year-old, and after each chapter, there's an essay about the Global Development Goals and the work of so many of you here in the room. And so it's really a juxtaposition between one child choosing the charity within because of the others around him, and how that work is so important to children around the world. So the title, let me tell you a little bit about the story before I leave you. The title, Take Me With You, comes from the fact that my mother was an abused spouse and wife. And every day when she would try to escape that situation, I would say, take me with you. In fact, just to give you a very brief excerpt, my greatest fear as a child was that my mom would leave and not take me with her. Those nights when she would run past, barefoot out the door, I would put my head through the curtain against the window to see her drive off in her Volkswagen Bug, knowing that she was finally safe that night. She would reappear early the next morning in time to get ready for school and drive away again to escape to the safety of the classroom and her work. But I feared that one day she would not return and I would be left behind. Take me with you was my conviction and my plea to her. So she did finally take me with her, and she escaped that situation. And she married, first of all, she went to counseling to Reverend Jefferson Jackson, who was a Black Baptist minister. And he and my biological father had actually been the first co-chairs of the Black and White Ministerial Alliance of Kansas City in 1968, same year that Martin Luther King Jr. was killed. But she fell in love with Jefferson and married him, and all heck broke loose. He lost his church. She lost her job. She was the first integrated teacher in Bonner Springs High School. We had crosses burned on our property, and we were losing a custody battle that my biological father had started, who was embarrassed by the situation. So the day of the final court hearing, if you will, we escaped. So we left the trailer house door, and we got on an airplane, and we went to Vancouver, British Columbia. It was better to go north than south, we felt. And we didn't have work permits, so we finally had to make our way by the ferry system, and we were going to try to sneak back into the country unnoticed across the Olympic Peninsula. And on the ferry, on the way to Port Angeles, a Canadian gentleman with a felt hat and a feather in his cap, came up to us. We were quite a threesome. My mother had this poodle that Jefferson had given her in her purse, and we had these maps out, yes, maps. And he said, you people ought to think about this place called Sequim, Washington. It's not very far from where you will land, and they would accept you there. And he walked off. And so we landed, had a hard time getting a taxi, hotel room, not as bad as Kansas, but still, not easy. We made our way the next day to Sequim, Washington. We hid out on a horse ranch for a year. And finally, we re-entered the school system. And somewhere along the line, I'd given my real name. And so one day, the authorities came. They arrested me, took me to juvenile center. They held my mother in contempt of court for kidnapping. And then they took me back to Kansas to be with my father. 6 months later, in the middle of a snowstorm, not being able to get any mail from my mom, not knowing what would happen, there's a whole story about me not understanding why I couldn't hear from her, and a letter that I finally was able to wrestle away from my father, which just said, "I love you," which I knew meant that she had no way to communicate with me. And so I grabbed my green knit hat with $20 bills sewn inside it from a woman in the church that they'd given me in the detention center, my Bible with phone numbers across the country, and my deflated basketball. You never know when you're going to need a basketball. And I asked if I could go play in the snow. And then I set about my journey. In one of the worst snowstorms of that 2 or 3 year period in Kansas, and I kept making my way. And I'll share with you just a little bitty excerpt, but essentially at this point in time, I'd made it about 10 miles. I was going through the woods trying to make my way to the Kansas River and to get across the Kansas River to the next town. And I had to walk along the burr. So there was a railroad track, and then a burr, and then the river. And so I had to walk along that burr, if you will, because there was really nowhere else to be able to walk. I looked toward the faint glow of DeSoto, that's the town, across the tracks, flashing lights passed. As the lights dimmed, I started moving again. The junction of the tracks on Wyandotte Street grew closer with each step. It didn't matter. I was out of options. If I couldn't cross this bridge, I couldn't run away. I reached Wyandotte Street about 15 minutes later and thought, it's over. I looked up at the night sky. Not a single star broke the clouds. I shook my head. Kansas will have to be home now. I climbed the berm slowly to meet my fate. Standing at the junction of the tracks on Wyandotte Street, I looked around. The police lights were gone. Darkness and empty fields surrounded me. And to the south, the glow of DeSoto appeared brighter across the river. I began to walk toward the light, keeping a few yards of the street.